Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 17th of August in the 33rd week of 2012. For more than 20 years, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion on the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and when locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good people at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight are David Johnson and Ron Szoke. Our format will be a little different from the norm. We'll start off with David's account of a recent trip to Cuba and branch out from there into some other considerations, specifically and generally about the American Empire. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about the American Empire for more than twice the 20 years we've been on the air. Chomsky has said that in the American media, either repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true and will sound like it's from Neptune. The program tonight we're calling the Cuba y Ecuador Sí, Yankee No edition. Events involving all three of those countries this last week will detain us for the hour. And we'll start particularly with this account of a recent trip to Cuba by our friend and colleague David Johnson, the proprietor of the Illinois World Labor Hour on the aforementioned community radio station, and David, I'm blocking on what you call the television program.
Illinois, I'm sorry, the television program is Labor's Worldview.
Labor's Worldview.
Yes.
Sorry, I just went off the top of my head. Labor's Worldview here on Urbana Public Television, seen on Sunday afternoons at 4. I've got that right? Mm-hmm. Okay, good. Let's start with Cuba. What took you to Cuba? Why'd you go to Cuba? Did you have any trouble getting there? What was the arrangement?
Well, I mean, I have no great love for one-party communist states. My wife had relatives to this day in Poland, and we had a little bad experience of trying to get her cousin to come for a visit back in the late 70s, which took us almost a year to arrange. But I've heard a lot about Cuba growing up. I mean, I was like 4 years old when the Cuban Missile Crisis happened. I don't remember it. But there's always been this bugaboo, if you will, this boogeyman, if you will, about Cuba, just 90 miles off, U.S. territory. Right. And so I just wanted to go and see for myself. And, one of the few things good I'll say about Obama is he did ease travel restrictions in 2009 for American citizens to travel to Cuba. I mean, it was just a slight easement. And so I thought I'd take advantage of it and go, see for myself. And anyway, so did that. And you got to go through, jump through hoops, if you will. It costs more. I mean, you have to pay like around $300 just to have the privilege, permission from the U.S. government to go to Cuba. And you fill out the paperwork, and then you have to travel under a blanket license that a tour operator has from the Treasury Department. And then once you get there, you're expected to stay with the group and do all their activities and not go off on your own. I mean, this is from the U.S. Treasury Department. Right. This is not by the Cuban government. Anyway, so once I got there, this was under the auspices of a conference at the University of Havana for 5 days. I was there a week. I stayed for 2 days at the conference and then went off on my own. And I was surprised.
That didn't make him happy, huh?
Well, the Cubans didn't care. I was really surprised. I went there because I wanted to see for myself. I mean, I was kind of expecting to, get a song and dance from the Cuban presenters there, because it was like an equal amount of Americans that were making presentations as well as Cubans. And I was expecting a song and dance propaganda line about how everything's, wonderful and rosy in Cuba. Well, I was frankly shocked, pleasantly, that all the Cuban presenters were pretty much frank about what's happened in the past and what currently the current situation is in very realistic terms, in the sense that this worked, this didn't, we got problems here, problems there. And in fact, if anything, most of the Cuban presentations were critical of the current economy and political system and, of course, the media. One presenter went even so far as to say is that we have a state media now in Cuba. What we need is public media. Mm-hmm. and the current state media insults the intelligence of the average member of the Cuban Communist Party. I mean, that's quite a statement, frankly. But anyway, so I went off, and of course, every night after the conference, I would go out and about, and, to bars and restaurants and talk to regular Cubans and get a feel of what they thought about things. I went out in the countryside about 3 hours west of Havana, a place called Vinales, which is the Pinar del Rio area. Beautiful natural scenery, lots of caves, but it gave me a chance to actually stay there. And the whole time I was in Cuba, with the exception of the first night, I stayed in what they call casa particulars, which are basically Cubans who rent out rooms in their homes. And I wanted to do this because, one, it was a lot cheaper, and two, more importantly, that way I could actually meet and talk to the Cuban people. And this is what's interesting, is that the United States calls their restrictions, well, they say it's in order to facilitate people-to-people exchange, but it's just the opposite. They basically expect you to stay within these tour groups and not go off on your own. I guess they're afraid of American citizens finding out what the truth is and what the Cuban people really think. Frankly, Carl, I was really surprised, for a supposedly oppressive society, how much Cubans knew about what was going on in the United States.
I'm sure that's true. A lot more than we know about what's going on in Cuba, eh?
Yes, indeed. And what's interesting is that, there's a lot of talk about well, first of all, let me explain. This is what's really kind of blew my mind, was every single restaurant, bar, whatever, even corner little snack shop or whatever, is owned actually by the Cuban government. The only real private enterprise in Cuba are people that drive taxis, even though they have also Cuban-owned enterprise, official taxis, if you will. But people driving taxis with their own cars, people renting out rooms to foreigners from their homes. That's about the only private business activities that exist in Cuba currently. But there's talk about wanting to transform a lot of the state enterprises into worker-owned cooperatives.
I gather that Raul Castro has been pushing for reforms of that sort, that since he's become the effective authority in succession to his brother, that there's been a movement in that direction.
Yes, indeed. In fact, the cooperatives have already, I think for about the last 15, 20 years, there's actually been cooperatives started and running in the agricultural segment of the economy, and you've got quite a few cooperative farms that exist currently, but there's also privately owned farms. That's the third thing I forgot to mention, is that there are some privately owned farms. They're small, but what's interesting, Carl, was that previously I had been to Mexico. As far as comparing apples to apples, as for countries I've been in Latin America, I've been to Mexico, I've been to Jamaica, I've been to Brazil, and what really struck me was that you don't see the same type of, people are poor in Cuba, but it's not the same kind of poverty you see in Jamaica and Mexico and Brazil. You don't see people living in cardboard and tin metal shacks. You don't see people sleeping on the streets. You don't see that people that are really thin. In fact, a lot of Cubans are fairly plump. Actually. Also, what I noticed one of the first things I noticed was how good everyone's teeth were. Frankly, the dental hygiene of Cubans I encountered was better than some parts of Illinois I've been to, frankly. And I'm not saying that disparagingly. I'm just saying that they do have excellent medical care. They're well fed. Everyone has a house to live in that's well constructed. But they do lack, of course, consumer goods. There's a lot of things they can't get that we kind of take for granted. But no one's starving. And the Cubans in general, the attitude was that they do want to. They like this whole talk about worker-owned cooperatives and talking to people that work in, like, say, the restaurants. They're real excited about this, but they also have a healthy skepticism. They said, well, talk's talk and action is action, and we'll see how soon this happens.
And of course, there's still an economic blockade of Cuba by the United States that goes back to the Eisenhower administration, actually.
Yes, indeed.
And it really ramped up under the Kennedy brothers, who started the tradition that Cuba is probably the most terrorized state in the Western Hemisphere as a result of the campaign Operation Mongoose under the Kennedys almost 60 years ago. the attempt to overthrow the Cuban government because of the threat of the good example. We can't have something like that in the Western Hemisphere, people making their own decisions on economic matters like this. They have to check it with Washington, and these people weren't.
Indeed, and that's the other interesting thing I found there, Carl, was that people there that I talked to, the Cubans, I mean, they were. They actually, a lot of them were wanting to see maybe some more international business come in. Currently, the only international businesses are European companies and Canadian companies that have joint venture operations with the Cuban government, mainly in the tourism industry, like hotels and resorts. Of course, they said that we don't want to give up our health care. We don't want to be like the United States. I mean, they actually said that. They knew about our healthcare system. They said that we don't want to give up our educational opportunities, because the other thing is that all education is free in Cuba, from kindergarten all the way to the PhD at the college level. And they said that they were shocked when I told them how much university education costs here, and then in relation to how much I earn as a carpenter, you know, just to give them a comparison, and they couldn't believe it. They said, "Why do you people put up with that?" Well,
it's a very good question. A very good question.
They were very critical too. I mean, they weren't afraid to express their opinions. The common theme was that Fidel Castro stayed too long. He should have stepped down maybe, you know, 10 years after the revolution, let somebody else take over. And so I didn't see any fear whatsoever about people expressing their opinions.
Did you see Michael Moore's picture, Sicko, that includes a long section on Cuban medicine and so forth?
I saw Sicko, but I didn't see that extra segment on it. But I heard about it, but I've never seen it.
It's one of the few accounts in recent popular culture in this country, it seems to me, that's given a picture of the society that you've been describing these last few minutes. And I think there are good reasons why there's hesitation within the American empire to have the account of what's going on in Cuba be presented in an honest fashion. I mean, if they do that, we're gonna have too many people around in this country who want some of the same, and we really can't have that. There's another irony, it seems to me, in the question of the economic blockade, though. A number of years ago, before he went to jail, the ex-governor of Illinois led a delegation of Illinois businessmen to Cuba and petitioned the federal government to lift the economic blockade because of the advantages to Illinois business, and by implication and trickle down and all, Illinois workers. Yes, that's another story. But at least the idea that the economic blockade was preventing business opportunities that would benefit businesses in Illinois suggested there was another dimension of the propaganda campaign whereby the U.S. tries to keep Cuba isolated, and that was that complaints were coming from Americans who wanted to do business with Cuba.
You know what gets me, Carl, is what did Cuba do to deserve this? I mean, what I'm saying is why should, what did the Cubans ever do to the American people?
Well, that's a very good question. It seems to me the question generalizes that. I mean, in some sense, you can ask it about Iran, too. Here we hear every day from all sides in the narrow American political spectrum about how, boy, somebody's going to have to attack the Iranians pretty soon. If the Israelis don't do it, we'll have to, or we'll have to unleash the Israelis to do it. So, nonsense. What did the Iranians ever do to us? Well, it seems to me there's a similar answer. Cuba in 1959, Iran in 1979 stopped following orders. In each case, the country was under the control of a dictator that the U.S. had put in place or supported. And in each case, a popular revolution overthrew that dictator. And there's a sense in which the American government has never forgiven these countries for not accepting the government we've picked out for them. It generalizes in American history. I mean, we could say that the Vietnam War was developed along the same lines, that the South Vietnamese didn't have the good sense to stick with the government that we'd arranged for them, and as a result, we had to kill them.
You know, the other thing that struck me too in Cuba, compared to Jamaica, Mexico, Brazil, outside the tourist areas, that is, was the police. I mean, you know, I was in various parts of Jamaica, especially like in Kingston, the city of Kingston, or like in various parts of Mexico, where you see the police riding around in pickup trucks with machine guns and shotguns, bulletproof vests, just glaring. glaring at the people, and just like they're itching just to hurt somebody, kill somebody. And you see the people, they're definitely frightened when they see the police, and the people got this like sort of beaten down look about them. You know, I didn't see that anywhere in Cuba. The police I encountered would just stand. They seemed pretty laid back. I saw Cuban people talking to them, joking with them, and I didn't. You know, that's what struck me too. Even though a couple of the Cuban street hustlers that you find anywhere in the world would come up to me and say, oh, you know, trying to hustle me for prostitutes or what have you, would say, we got to be careful, or I got to be careful because Havana has 2 million people and 1 million people work for the police. Well, I'm not so sure how true that is, to be quite honest, you know. But nevertheless, I didn't see that type of fear and repression like I've seen in other parts of Latin America and the Caribbean.
Well, this summer, particularly in America, it's worth thinking about as we watch a coordinated national movement to make sure that popular protest in America doesn't grow beyond a level where the local police can handle it. We hear disquieting accounts of the way in which the Department of Homeland Security and the coordinated police organizations across the country are preparing for protests in America associated with the political conventions and the election. Now, there's precious little politics actually going on in the political conventions and the elections. I mean, it's a put-up job from beginning to end. But there's a great deal of worry amongst our rulers about the fact that people may begin to notice that and complain this summer. And the response is an overwhelming support for the police. So, I mean, when we come closer to your Jamaican and other models of police repression in this country, I think that a lot of Americans would have had trouble predicting what would happen to the Occupy movement, that the police repression of the Occupy movement across the country, which is by no means over, would be as brutal and unconstitutional as it has been, and they've got away with it. So the notion is that the populace is resting, and it's also restless, and the police will be needed before long in America as well. So it's an interesting comparison. You're watching News from Neptune. I'm Carl Estabrook. My guest is David Johnson, recently back from a trip to Cuba, the pearl of the Caribbean that the U.S. has been busily repressing since the revolution in 1959. You mentioned at the beginning your vast youth at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, David, but there was a reference to it just recently by Noam Chomsky, our mentor for this program, in an account of Hiroshima Day remembrances. He was saying that not only do we recall the atom bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August, we're also coming up to the 50th anniversary of what has been called the most dangerous moment in human history. And Chomsky was referring to the fact that actually has just emerged in recent years that we were far closer to a nuclear exchange, as they say in the political science department, in October of 1962 in the so-called Cuban Missile Crisis, where the United States essentially was willing to risk nuclear war, about a 50% chance, thought then President John Kennedy, risk nuclear war in order to prevent the Russians from doing in Cuba precisely what the United States was doing in Turkey. That is, putting in mid-range missiles armed against the national enemy. So, I mean, there was no reciprocity here. It wasn't a situation in which the U.S. was countering a threat that it was not itself completely guilty of. I mean, the U.S. was doing, Khrushchev was barely catching up with what the U.S. was doing by putting his weapons into Cuba. And in the event, it was Khrushchev's good sense that probably saved the world from a nuclear exchange in the fall of 1962. We've recently come even more to realize that there was an incident off Cuba where a nuclear-armed Russian submarine was under attack by an American destroyer. And the American destroyer was apparently dropping depth charges on this Russian submarine in the course of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the Russian submarine, the commanders of the Russian submarine, thought that under these conditions that they should launch their nuclear weapons. And apparently the command structure of the Russian submarine involved yes votes from the 3 top officers, not just the captain, but his executive officer and one other or something. And one officer held out. And they said, no, we've got to wait for further instructions. No, don't send those missiles off. But they were within 1 vote, apparently, of loosing that missile as a result of the American attack. Now, luckily, that one guy, his name has actually surfaced in a discussion in Havana a couple of years ago of the Cuban Missile Crisis. But the shocking realization that the U.S. was inches away from nuclear involvement is something that should give us pause.
I think two people have to realize, Carl, or I should say a lot of people don't realize, is that the Cubans wanted the Russians to install those missiles because they were just the previous year attacked in the Bay of Pigs invasion.
Absolutely.
The U.S. had backed all these former henchmen of the dictator Batista and armed them, trained them in Florida, and gave them surplus U.S. Landing vessels and even some ships, destroyers. And they were doing a full-scale invasion of Cuba, and the Cubans were able to fight it back. And they were not going to back down on. I mean, they wanted to keep their country, sovereign. They weren't going to bow to the demands of the United States after they'd had their revolution. There was good and bad of the revolution, but the good thing was that there was a lot of land reform, and also mob-owned casinos were nationalized, right. And this had the support of the 95% of the Cuban population, and that's why they wanted the Russians to bring the missiles in, was to defend themselves.
I think more Americans may have learned something about the relationship of the U.S. and the Cuban Revolution from the Godfather 3 picture, wasn't it? Than any other single source. And, that the poets often get there first, and in this case, a movie director, I think, takes on the poet's role. You're watching News from Neptune. We've been joined now by our colleague Ron Szoke, and we're in the midst of a discussion of David Johnson's recent trip to Cuba and the politics of the U.S. and Cuba over the last 50 years and more, on the anniversary almost of the Cuban Missile Crisis, as we call it in this country, in October of 1962. We know some more things about those events after all these years, including the fact that the notion that the missiles in Cuba were defensive, that is, to prevent an American invasion, was not a Russian or Cuban fantasy. That, in fact, the American plans from the Bay of Pigs that David was just talking about, up through 1962, the planning documents, which were released after 50 years, began to show or include the understanding that the U.S. would continue to encourage revolution in Cuba, which, according to those documents, would eventually involve the landing of American troops in support of the revolution. The American propaganda line was that Cuba was languishing under the Castro government and was ripe for revolt. As soon as the exiles landed at the Bay of Pigs, the country would rise against Castro. Well, it happened just the other way. The country supported the revolution and attacked the invaders. But the U.S. had, as part of its imperial planning, the notion that American troops would be required by the end of 1962. So the installation of missiles in Cuba as a defensive measure made a good deal of sense from the point of view of the Cubans and the Russians. The American policy in regard to its empire is remarkably consistent we sometimes have the idea that American presidents and secretaries of state and secretaries of war, defense, are sort of making it up as they go along. Suddenly they decide, hey, it might be a good idea to invade South Vietnam, or it might be a good idea to put missiles in Eastern Europe, or something else occurs as a bright idea to one of our national functionaries. It doesn't work that way. The planning is much more consistent. It varies little from administration to administration, in spite of the propaganda that's necessary. The narcissism of small differences in American political parties, where they have to insist upon product differentiation. Coke really is different from Pepsi. Romney really is different from Obama in terms of what foreign policy will be followed. Obama really is different from Bush. Change? No, not at all. The policy, the American policy, is remarkably consistent over time, not only in regard to our little neighborhood over here, as an American Secretary of State said, referring to Latin America, but also indeed worldwide policy. Policy in the Middle East, policy in Southeast Asia, policy in Southwest Asia these days. The American empire remains remarkably consistent in terms of the policies that are followed. One of the best historians I know says the first question to be asked about any human affair is cui bono, who profits, whose interests are being served, what's being done here for what purposes, cui bono. And if we ask that about American foreign policy, the example we have perhaps seen more clearly now than we have in many a year, although it's easy to trace it back, is what the Occupy Wall Street movement has been calling the 1%. It's only the very top echelon of the American economic structure that profits from American policy. It's their interests that are being served. The answer to cui bono for American foreign policy, including American wars, are that fraction of 1%. Now, it's important to try to show why that's true, how that happens, and so forth. And in a funny way, that's what the Godfather movie does in regard to Cuba, much more accurately than any of the things that were being said about Cuban policy or Latin American policy at the time. And it seems to me that if we are doing our job as citizens, one of the first things we should do is try to pierce that veil of propaganda, self-justificatory fog, misleading accounts of how the U.S. is fighting for truth, beauty, and justice around the world, and try to understand what the interests involved are, what the U.S. is actually doing, and why it's doing it. It's not easy to do. It takes a good deal of effort, and Cuba is a very interesting example because we have more than almost 60 years of the Cuban Revolution and the American response to it as a worthwhile exercise to see what the U.S. empire does around the world. Comments on Cuba, Ron? You want to say a word or two about this issue?
I've got my breath back, I hope. I'm rushing around from pillar to post today, but I did want to bring in this article that was in the July 2012 Patterns magazine published by the local PBS affiliate, WILL TV, and it's called Dispatch from Cuba. I wanted to get your comments on it, David. By Stephen J. Lyons. This says, in the editor's note, we asked Stephen, a local author and writer who joined WILL's Cuba tour May 13th through 21st, to share his impressions of the country with Patterns readers. When were you in Cuba, by the way?
I was there from June 17th to June 24th.
Who sponsored your trip?
It was through a company, a tour operator called Global Exchange. I'm sorry, Global Justice, excuse me, Global Justice.
This says, quoting author Paul Theroux, once wrote that, quote, any country which displays more than one statue of the same living politician is a country headed for trouble.
Where's that trouble going to come from? Huh?
In Cuba, a nation that has had its share of troubles, the most frequently displayed statuary is that of a dead man, national hero Jose Marti. Did you see that?
Yes.
Yes, yes. He reigns supreme throughout the island nation of 11 million citizens, from the majestic Jose Marti Plaza in the French colonial coastal city of Cienfuegos, I can't pronounce these things,
Cienfuegos,
to a simple unnamed park in the crowded municipality of Guanabacoa in eastern Havana, to the Jose Marti International Airport, where the departure board on Terminal 2 features direct flights to Miami, and Miami only, courtesy of American Airlines, American Eagle, and Sky King. But don't try to book flights through AA.com. Let's say the business model is fluid and complicated. Fidel Castro, Cuba's most famous living politician, makes occasional appearances on billboards, including the massive silhouette bookending the Plaza de Revolution. Did you see that? The Plaza.
I saw just a few images of Fidel Castro, a lot of Jose Marti, and a ton of Che Guevara.
Yes, that's the next paragraph here. The other bookend in the Plaza is the most popular iconic image in Cuba and maybe the world, that of Che Guevara, an Argentinian. And of course, there are the impressive Jose Marti Memorial, which keeps vigil over the huge expanse of concrete in the Plaza. Fidel and Che light up the night, perhaps one of the most dependable currents of electricity in Havana, a city of 2 million badly in need of plaster, paint, potable water, and an infusion of Yankee capital. Okay, this is the theme that gets into the middle of this. Is well, it's the old horrors of communism theme. The tourist stalls are filled with Che memorabilia, Che caps with red stars and the tricolored 5-striped Cuban flag, Che books and pamphlets, Che buttons, refrigerator magnets and T-shirts, and Che posters, even though with one with Lenin, John, that is, with the caption, "Imagine." Did you see any of this?
No John Lennon, but lots of, yes, I did see a lot of that you're describing.
Yeah. Whatever I had imagined about Cuba before our people tour was of little use. In the scrubby landscape of rural southern Cuba, living conditions were poor and animals were hungry, if not starving. Women rubbed their arms begging for soap. Men plowed fields with teams of oxen yoked to primitive single-row plows. Rice dried in the open on roads. Families got around on bicycles and in horse-drawn wagons. Workers were transported to fields in open-bed trucks. Privately owned cars are rare. Even the famed 1950-era cabs in Havana are state-owned. The shelves in the bodega are ancient. In ancient Trinidad, where citizens cashed in their monthly ration books, were sparse. In Cuba, you learn to make do with what you don't have.
Some true, some blatantly a lie.
Yeah.
I saw no starving animals. What was the first part of that? Going back to the first paragraph. He was talking about near the starving
living
animals.
conditions were poor. Animals were hungry, if not starving.
Compared to what?
Yeah, right.
Compared to the United States. Compared to Yankee Ridge in southeast Urbana.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Compared to Mexico, Haiti, Honduras. No.
Or Alabama.
Absolutely not.
Yeah. How about Alabama, Mississippi, and
That's
Louisiana?
also a very good comparison.
Yes.
I've seen a lot of rumbled down shacks in rural Mississippi and Alabama. That's probably the worst you'll see in Cuba as far as accommodations out in the countryside. But you know what? They're not made out of wood. They're made out of concrete block and stucco and thatched roofs, which is going to last a lot longer than the thrown together wood shacks in Alabama, Mississippi. So partly true, partly not. But of course, that's the most effective propaganda, is it? Mix a little truth with embellishment.
Right. Yeah.
Does this article mention the American economic blockade at all? Funny that didn't come up.
Right. So the usual pattern for American visitors to Cuba is when they hit the ground running and go to some dissident and interview him about the lack of freedom. So
actually, most of the people I know who've been to Cuba recently have gone in the summer and have gone straight to the ice cream stands in Havana, which apparently are some of which are privatized.
And then the other thing they must always comment on is the shopping conditions. There are very few things on the shelves.
Well, that's funny because that's partly true. But also, I walked by in Havana, in the central part of Havana. This was not in the tourist areas, actual department stores that looked like mannequins, or had mannequins in the window with fairly new, fashionable, clothing. I saw people in those stores. I saw some of these stores that sold appliances. And in fact, in my video that I've shown here on UPTV, when I stayed out in the countryside in Vanales, I mean, one scene in the film, I'm going through the people's house, and I go into the kitchen. I mean, they have air. I mean, it's really nice. A woman who I showed this to, who's married to a union plumber friend of mine. She's from Honduras originally. When she saw that segment of the film, we went into the kitchen of the house. She goes, "Oh wow, that's really nice." Expecting something horrible. You know, I mean, of course, conditions in Honduras, I've never been to Honduras, but they were just recently there in April, and there were dead bodies in the streets. The military was driving around all the time in trucks with guns. Journalists disappear and turn up dead all the time recently. People are impoverished, people are begging, and it's just what I've heard from her and him. There's nothing like that in Cuba.
And of course, in Honduras, the U.S. has just sponsored a coup.
That's correct.
You know, we have got a situation in which they're accepting the government we picked out for them.
Yeah, things need to improve in Cuba. There's no doubt there, and you know, that's funny because there's some things that, you know, consumer goods to make life a little easier would be, like, for instance, I couldn't find ice anywhere. And if you go somewhere to buy something, you better take a backpack or your own plastic bag because they don't have any. You got to carry it out by your own means. But I mean, well, I guess I can only say is compare that to having free education, free health care, enough to
Plastic
eat.
bags doesn't make up for the lack of that. Huh?
It's a matter of priorities. You know, I mean, there's always room for improvement.
What's remarkable to me is the number of people who immediately goes looking for dissidents there to interview. Their total lack of interest in dissidents in their own country.
Very good point, Ron.
Yeah, right.
Let's see, we have Leonard Peltier that's been in prison now for how long? Mumi Abdul-Jabbar. And they want to get, of course, Julian Assange.
Say nothing of Bradley Manning, yes.
Exactly. Bradley Manning, yes.
Yeah.
So there, dissidents are freedom-loving Democrats who are saints and heroes, but here dissidents apparently are misfits and malcontents. That's the thing we always hear about them. Continuing, people seem better off in Havana and in Cienfuegos where there were more stores. Can anyone afford to buy that stuff in the stores? That's the question, of course. Old Havana's narrow, pedestrian-only streets led to delightful surprises, solo guitarists, caricature artists, performers on stilts, bookstalls, outdoor cafes, and tourists from around the world. The 4-mile Malecon, the seawall that snakes along the Caribbean, was a pleasant respite from the city and featured artwork celebrating the 11th annual Havana bicentennial, including a giant mirror titled Happily Ever After. In a daycare center run by the Catholic Church in one of Havana's poorest neighborhoods, children greeted us with songs, smiles, and a poem. I found a shell by the sea, I thought of you. we brought them much needed supplies of books.
Oh, this is too funny.
Yeah, books, pens, pencils, and crayons. They needed more of everything.
Well, they'll take whatever they can get.
Sure,
and
sure.
There's, you know, everywhere I've been in the world, you have, let's put it this way, I mean, in the lesser developed world, you know, it's a matter of one thing. Yeah, they'll take pencils. You know, the thing is going by. I went by a Cuban school, grade school, and you know, all the kids, they have like uniforms, but that's not unique to Cuba. Everywhere I've been in Latin America, children have uniforms. In Jamaica, that was the case, and everything else. But you know, I saw them out there with notepads and with pens, and I don't think they got all their pens and pencils and notepads from visiting American tourists. I mean, I don't know about that for sure. How rare that is.
Yeah, in the Corona cigar factory. Did you see a cigar factory? No.
I was at a place where it was actually grown in Vanales.
We watched women roll tobacco in smoke-filled halls under sallow lighting. We were not allowed to take photos in the factory. Workers rarely last beyond 7 years of toil. In a rare moment of candor, our guide said of the woman hunched over a workbench deveining leaves, "This is not a good job, my friends." At the Hotel Nacional, former UN diplomat Camila Garcia Lopez Trigos Trigo opened his lecture on U.S.-Cuban relations by warning, "This is not a beautiful story with a happy ending." Yet history is organic, changing with each new moment. For me, and perhaps for most of the 28 members of our tour, our history with Cuba was just beginning, and the ending is far from being written.
Well,
Music up and out. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, David, did you say you took film? You did some filming while you were
I did
there?
a lot of filming. I never had any restrictions. I mean, I even took, photographs of, I didn't make it into the final editing and everything, but I was a little, let's put it this way, I was a little apprehensive about taking video footage of police.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
But, I probably could have gotten away with it. And I was just, let's put it this way.
Can't do that in Chicago, right?
Well, that's true. And but I was just a little apprehensive about doing that, so I didn't. But anywhere else, I didn't have any problems taking film footage.
When and where will your film be available? When can people see your...
Well, it's been shown on UPTV already. I can't remember. I think it was 3 weeks ago was the first showing, and and then there was a repeat of that, and maybe we'll have it shown again sometime in the future. But if anybody would like a copy of the film, you're more than happy to contact UPTV, and I'd be more than happy to get you a copy, mail you a copy.
Excellent. You're watching News from Neptune, the Cuba y Ecuador Si Yankee No edition. Maybe as time is growing short, we should say a word, David, about why we included Ecuador with Cuba today. What's Ecuador been doing that should be mentioned in the same breath?
Well, in the same breath, Ecuador, they had a... interesting thing happened in Ecuador back, what was it, I believe about 8-10 years ago, was when the government at that time, which was very corrupt, was paid off by the Bechtel Corporation, U.S. multinational based in San Francisco. They privatized their water supply. And it wasn't just their municipal water supply. Basically, the people who had wells, like say in the rural areas that dated back to the time of the Incas, were going to be charged a monthly fee to draw their own water from their own wells that their ancestors had dug, and people were going to be charged for collecting rainwater. Basically, the government sold every single drop of water from whatever source to the Bechtel Corporation. Well, this sparked a revolution in Ecuador, and as a result, there was finally a true democratic election, and a man named Rafael Carrera, who used to actually live in Urbana for a couple of years when he was studying here for his PhD, became president. Other similar things have happened in Venezuela, Paraguay, Bolivia, and basically in some degree Argentina and Brazil. And basically what this is that, Latin American countries, a lot of them are finally having true democracy, and they're doing the will of the people instead of the will of multinational corporations.
Maybe Carl was alluding to the Ecuadorian embassy in London.
Well, I thought that might be a good... I had to give a little background here, okay, about what the situation in Latin America. But yes, we've got a recent incident here involving Julian Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks, who basically exposed the lies of the U.S. government and their foreign policy by putting on the internet all these documents. Millions of them. And I don't think the U.S. foreign policy establishment in Washington is too happy with Julian Assange because he exposed their lies.
Yes.
So basically, the last 2 years, they've been harassing him. And lo and behold, they were able to get a Swedish prosecutor to have some kind of questionable charge that I heard was brought up by 2 prostitutes that were paid off, saying that he'd committed sex crime, whatever that was. They're not real specific on that, but they basically want to extradite him to Sweden for questioning. Well, he's not been charged with anything. He's willing to. The legal team has offered to have Swedish authorities come to England to do any kind of questioning they want, but they refused to do that.
He's even offered to go back to Sweden under one condition.
Yeah.
That he's not extradited to the United States. That's correct.
Yeah.
So that's the situation, and he has been fighting it in the British courts. He's an Australian citizen, but his court appeals ran out, and he took refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy and asked for political asylum in Ecuador. And Rafael Carrera took always a couple weeks to make his decision, but he finally granted him asylum because he first asked that if there was assurances that Assange would not be extradited from either England or Sweden to the United States under any circumstances, then he would not give him asylum. Well, they wouldn't give him those assurances, which in and of itself exposes the lie that that's what the real reason is they want to get him to Sweden, is that basically they want to get him to the United States, put him on a show's trial, throw him in jail the rest of his life, possibly murder him through execution, because there's been some American politicians calling for Julian Assange's execution for something that basically is journalism. I mean, this is no different than what Daniel Ellsberg did with the Pentagon Papers back in 1971.
Yeah, I get the distinct impression that the Americans would like to get their hands on him.
Not the Americans, the American government.
Yes.
That's corporate-controlled American government.
Yeah, and then kill him. But maybe he can be shot while he's trying to escape or something.
Daniel Ellsberg was on Democracy Now! This morning, drawing exactly the parallel that David was talking about there. And it's the tender mercies of the American government, I think, are not to be trusted here. And if we want an example, simply look at what they've done to Bradley Manning. We have a president who asserts that he has the power to detain indefinitely anyone who is associated with terrorism.
What they defined as terrorism.
Oh, exactly. Anything in terrorism.
I mean, use of Neptune could be declared terrorist.
Indeed, yes. In fact, there is a major court case right now where a group of American academics, activists, reporters, and others have gone into court and said, look, the people we talk to in order to write about these matters, discuss these matters, are exactly the sort of people that association with whom will lead us to be liable to the indefinite detention by the American government. And so the judge said, well, that's nuts. Let's get the government in here to talk about it. The government lawyers come in and the judge says, well, look, obviously this is nonsense, isn't it? I mean, simply reporters doing their job, academics doing their jobs, they couldn't run afoul of this provision of the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA as it's called, that would lead to indefinite detention, could they? And the government lawyers said, we can't say that. So
I thought we were just suspected insurgents.
Yes.
It's amazing. What's really amazing is how powerful of a threat the truth is to those people, the 1% in power.
This is precisely right.
To maintain their illusion, basically their storyline.
Yes.
Which is totally false, of course, to say the least.
That's absolutely true, and it seems to me that we're just horrible examples of this day after day. The Assange case, the case of WikiLeaks, should alert all Americans to this vast propaganda structure, which has as its object Americans. They're not interested in convincing people in Europe or Asia about the virtues of the American government. The only people they're afraid of is the American populace, and they're quickly arming themselves with police and other legal structures to protect themselves against this. But in the meantime, the fog of propaganda has to remain in place, and any attempt to blow it away, such as WikiLeaks represents, is a severe threat. And just how severe the threat is indicated by the links they're willing to go to in order to make sure that these things don't appear.
Did you see this story last week? I didn't note down the exact source, how the American government was leaning on Ecuador, threatening to withdraw American subsidies and so on, trading agreements and so on, if they gave asylum to Assange.
Yes, that's exactly what. That, of course, is one of the things that is going on behind the scenes while Ecuador tried to decide. But I mean, it's obvious that they were under all sorts of threats from the Americans about economic and other reprisals that would be taken if they were to do such a thing. Correa is no fool. He knows what the American government is doing there, and they had to count the cost. I mean, it's whose line is it about Mexico? Poor Mexico, so far for God and so so close to the United States. Well,
yes.
you know, this is this were Mr. Korea's meditations. It seems to me this last week and two.
And it seems that's what saved South America more than anything is Mexico. I mean, there's been 3 stolen elections. The last 3 presidential elections in Mexico have been stolen blatantly. Greg Palast documents that in one of his films, the 2006, and there was improprieties, to say the least, in this most recent election we had just, I think it was a month ago. The United States will never allow the popular will of the Mexican people to be expressed in a democratically elected government of their representatives. It's too close.
It's if situation is reversed at all, and we begin to think about the sorts of things being done to the United States, the interference in American elections and American government by some foreign power of the sort that the U.S. does as a matter of course in these other countries, I mean, it's unimaginable. The situation is not reversible, even in thought, even in imagination. Mm-hmm. We couldn't think of it. You're watching News from Neptune. We have one more segment we wanted to get in today related to this book. There we go. The Magna Carta Manifesto by Peter Linebaugh. The subtitle is Liberties and Commons for All. Peter Linebaugh is a historian of historian of revolution in a lot of ways. Peter and I taught a course together years ago at a little Midwestern university that unaccountably is fetched up in upstate New York in the city of Rochester. And Peter and I were teaching a course of the sort that's been called in recent years Western civilization. Well, Peter is talking about an important line in Western civilization here. Yes, I know. I saw Ron chuckle, and I know you were thinking
to be tried, right?
Yes, exactly. Gandhi's line. It would be a good idea.
Right.
Western civilization. One of the glories of Western civilization is the Magna Carta. In the year 1215, the barons of England forced the King of England to grant a charter, the Great Charter. That's what Magna Carta means. The Great Charter of English liberties that included things such as habeas corpus, the right of any Englishman who was being imprisoned to come before a judge for a judgment about whether he was being legitimately imprisoned or not. Straightforward thing. The so-called Great Writ, which Thomas Jefferson thought was the fulcrum of English liberties, and insisted it was so important that it be enshrined not in the Bill of Rights, the amendments to the Constitution, but in the Constitution itself. And the significance that Jefferson accorded to the Great Writ, to habeas corpus, is indicated in some sense by the ease with which the present administration has set it aside and simply ignored it and managed to go back on the tradition running to the 13th century of the Great Charter. Noam Chomsky, our mentor, has written in a recent article called Destroying the Commons, How the Magna Carta Became a Minor Carta. Down the road, only a few generations, the millennium of Magna Carta, one of the great events of the establishment of civil and human rights, will arrive. Whether it will be celebrated, mourned, or ignored is not at all clear. That should be a matter of serious immediate concern. What we do right now or fail to do will determine what kind of world will greet that event. It is not an attractive prospect if present tendencies persist, not least because the Great Charter is being shredded before our eyes. Now, that's right, and it seems to me that the situation that you've been describing in Cuba, David, should alert us to some of the issues here, because it was precisely those rights of the commons that were being restored by the revolution in Cuba that is the cause for such dismay in Washington from the Kennedy administration on over the threat of a good example in Cuba. If restoring the commons, recapturing the liberties and commons for all, is the sort of thing that were worries are 1% very much indeed. And I can think of no better way to celebrate the upcoming anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis than reading Peter Lineau's book about the Magna Carta and reflecting upon what its meaning is for the situation in the United States in our day. You've been watching News from Neptune for the 17th of August in the 33rd week of 2012. Concluding comments, gentlemen, on Cuba, Ecuador, and liberty?
I think I'd like to sum it up as this. You know, you hear all the time on the news from government officials, President Obama on down, that the United States is the world leader for freedom and democracy and human rights. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. Let's face it, folks, what's driven U.S. foreign policy since the end of the Second World War, and even in some cases before the Second World War, has been the destruction of the commons, the destruction of people's self-determination to choose their representatives and their form of government. Their primary purpose is to strengthen corporate power. It's all about the money. Follow the money. Corporations help get politicians elected, and politicians in turn scratch their back with favors. So, case in point, there's many cases in points. In fact, Labor's Worldview is going to be having a three-part show coming up called The Power Principle, in which one segment of it, called Empire, the first of 3 parts, documents all the things the United States government has done since the end of the Second World War of rigging elections, overthrowing elected governments, outright military coups, which resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands, even in some cases hundreds of thousands of people, all so that American corporations and other foreign multinational corporations can gain control of a country's resources, push their wage rate and the standard of living down to subsistence levels so they can get cheap labor. That's what it's all about. That's what's happened in Haiti of most recent, when they went to the presidential palace and the special forces, U.S. Special Forces, went to the presidential palace in Haiti and forced the democratically elected president, Aristide, out at gunpoint and put him on a plane and dropped him and his family off in the Central African Republic. Why? Is because he wanted to do just some modest reforms to improve the lives of the average Haitian. That means raising their wage rates a little bit and providing some form of medical care.
And David, in our final moment here, you have a program coming up regarding wage rates in that sense, and
yes, it also ties
local
in,
area.
It
right?
also ties in with the commons. The Chicago Teachers Union have been in struggle now for several years in Chicago. Basically, what's happening there is that the politicians, first of all, Chicago has an appointed school board. That's right; they're not elected like other parts of the United States. They have an appointed school board by the mayor. The current school board for the last several years has consisted of wealthy individuals and corporate special interests. So what they've been doing is basically giving tax dollars, money, to private corporations that run private charter schools, letting public schools deteriorate to where they're literally falling apart, laying off teachers and support staff workers, and then saying, see, the public schools just don't work, we have to do more privatization in charter schools. And what's really interesting is a lot of this tax money that they're starving the public schools with has been going to private development projects, some of which have personally benefited certain members of the Chicago appointed school board. Now we're going to be having some members of the Chicago Teachers Union come down to Champaign, or actually Urbana, on Saturday, August 25th. That'll be a week from this coming Saturday at Channing Marine Foundation from 2 to 4. Again, that's Saturday, August 25th from 2 to 4 p.m. at Channing Murray. Come out and listen to the Chicago Teachers Union story, because they're going to want to move this model that they've been doing up there to the rest of the state of Illinois and the nation. We can't let that happen.
Thank you, David. This has been News from Neptune for August 17th, the 33rd week of 2012. Our program is named in honor of Noam Chomsky. This has been the Cuba y Ecuador Si Yankee No edition in honor of UNI alumnus Rafael Correa. If our program interested you, you might want to look at other programs heard regularly and repeated throughout the week here at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight on News from Neptune have been David Johnson and Ron Szoke. This and other editions of the program can be seen on the website newsfromneptune.com and on Facebook. I can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com and on Facebook, and I'm happy to receive your comments. Our thanks to UPTV, especially Jake, Jason, and Caleb. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward DeVere, what's past is prologue, what to come and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.